The morning of October 13th, 1898, began like any other in the farming community of Millbrook Valley. Frost clung to the wooden schoolhouse windows like delicate lace, and chimney smoke rose straight into the still air from a dozen scattered homesteads. The maple trees surrounding the one-room school blazed red and gold against the gray October sky, their leaves rustling with the promise of winter's approach. By evening, 5 children would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only their school slates and a mystery that would haunt the valley for nearly half a century. If you're drawn to unsolved mysteries and the secrets hidden in small communities, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover today about one of America's most chilling disappearances and the horrifying discovery that would finally provide answers decades later. The Millbrook Valley Schoolhouse sat at the crossroads of 3 dirt paths, serving farms scattered across rolling hills that stretched toward the distant Appalachian foothills. Built of rough-hewn logs chinked with clay and weathered clapboard siding, it housed 23 students, ranging in age from 6 to 16. The building's steep-pitched roof shed rain and snow efficiently, while its single stone chimney drew smoke from the pot-bellied stove that provided the only heat during harsh mountain winters. Miss Eleanor Hartwell, barely 20 herself and fresh from the county teaching college, had taught there for 2 years, walking 3 miles each morning from her boarding house in the nearest town. Her route took her along a winding creek bed, past the Brennan Dairy Farm, and through a grove of ancient oaks that had witnessed the valley's transformation from wilderness to settlement. She carried her lessons in a worn leather satchel and arrived each morning by 7:30 to light the stove and prepare the day's instruction. That Tuesday morning arrived with an unusual chill that penetrated even the thickest wool coats. The thermometer outside Henderson's General Store had registered 28 degrees at dawn, the earliest hard freeze anyone could remember. The trees had turned brilliant orange and red seemingly overnight, their leaves crackling underfoot as children made their way along the familiar paths that connected their homes to the center of their small educational universe. Martha Winslow, 14, and the eldest of the group that would soon disappear, helped her younger brother James across the creek that ran behind their family's 80-acre farm. The water ran shallow but swift, fed by mountain springs that never completely froze, even in the deepest winter. Martha tested each stepping stone carefully, her school dress hiked up to avoid the splash, while James followed with the complete trust that only a younger sibling can possess. At 12, James possessed a quick mind for arithmetic that impressed even Miss Hartwell, who had taught children from some of the finest families in the county seat. He could work multiplication problems in his head that left older students scratching their answers on slate, and he had already mastered long division, while his peers struggled with basic subtraction. His fascination with numbers extended beyond the classroom to the natural world around him, where he counted fence posts, calculated the ages of trees by their circumference, and estimated distances between landmarks with surprising accuracy. The Brennan siblings, twins Anne and Samuel, both 10 years old, raced each other down the hillside from their family's dairy farm, their breath visible in small puffs that dissipated quickly in the cold morning air. Their father operated the valley's only commercial dairy, with 20 Holstein cattle that grazed the richest pasture land for miles around. The twins had been raised among the animals and possessed an intuitive understanding of livestock that impressed neighboring farmers. They could predict weather changes by observing cow behavior and identify sick animals days before symptoms became obvious to adults. Anne carried herself with the confidence of a natural leader, often organizing games during recess and mediating disputes between younger children. Samuel, though identical in appearance, possessed a quieter nature and spent his free time sketching animals and landscapes in the margins of his school papers. Miss Hartwell had noticed his artistic talent and had begun providing him with extra drawing materials, encouraging him to develop skills that might someday take him beyond the confines of rural farm life. Bringing up the rear came 8-year-old Catherine Murphy, the youngest of the group and the baby of her family. She clutched a worn primer her older sister had passed down, its pages soft from countless readings and its corners rounded by small fingers that had traced each word dozens of times. Catherine's family had immigrated from County Cork 10 years earlier, and traces of her parents' Irish brogue still colored her speech, particularly when she became excited or upset. The Murphy farm occupied the smallest and least fertile plot in the valley, a fact that had forced the family to supplement their income through Catherine's mother's skill as a seamstress and her father's work as a blacksmith. Despite their modest circumstances, the Murphys maintained fierce pride in their heritage and insisted that all their children receive the best education available, even if it meant walking longer distances and making greater sacrifices than their more prosperous neighbors. These 5 children lived on farms within a mile radius of each other, though their families rarely socialized beyond church on Sundays and the occasional barn raising or harvest celebration. The social structure of the valley reflected the broader patterns of rural America, where proximity didn't necessarily guarantee friendship, and where economic differences could create invisible barriers even among neighbors who depended on each other for survival. The Winslows worked wheat and corn on 80 acres their grandfather had cleared from wilderness using nothing but axes, saws, and backbreaking labor. Their farmhouse, built of squared logs with a stone foundation, represented prosperity earned through 3 generations of careful stewardship and gradual expansion. Thomas Winslow served as one of the valley's informal leaders, mediating disputes and organizing community efforts when crises arose. The Brennan family had arrived more recently, but had quickly established themselves as essential to the valley's economy. Their Holstein cattle produced milk, butter, and cheese that supplied not only local families, but also the growing town 15 miles to the east. Margaret Brennan had brought dairy expertise from her childhood in Vermont, while her husband contributed mechanical skills that kept their equipment functioning and productive. The Murphys struggled on their smaller plot, growing vegetables and keeping chickens, their Irish determination compensating for what their land lacked in natural advantages. Sean Murphy's blacksmith skills made him valuable to every farmer in the valley, as he could repair plows, shoe horses, and fabricate the metal implements that kept agricultural operations running. His wife Mary supplemented their income by taking in sewing from families throughout the region. Miss Hartwell noticed nothing unusual about the children that morning as they settled into their assigned seats. The schoolroom smelled of chalk dust, wood smoke, and the lingering aroma of the lye soap used to scrub the floors each Friday afternoon. Sunlight streamed through windows that Martha had cleaned the previous week, casting geometric patterns across worn wooden desks that bore the carved initials of students from years past. Martha helped distribute the morning's writing exercises, while James worked ahead in his mathematics primer, solving problems that wouldn't be assigned for another 2 weeks. The Brennan twins whispered together over their shared slate, planning some elaborate game they would organize during the noon recess. Little Catherine practiced her letters with determined concentration, her tongue protruding slightly as she formed each character with painstaking care. The morning passed according to the familiar rhythm that governed rural education. Miss Hartwell called students to the front of the room to recite lessons, corrected pronunciation and arithmetic errors with gentle firmness, and maintained the disciplined atmosphere necessary for learning in a single room housing multiple grade levels. The older students helped younger ones with difficult passages, creating a family-like environment that extended the bonds of community into the educational sphere. At 11:30, Miss Hartwell dismissed the students for their noon meal. Most children brought cold biscuits and preserves, sometimes a hard-boiled egg or slice of cheese wrapped in cloth. The more prosperous families occasionally provided meat, while those facing leaner times made do with bread and whatever preserves remained from the previous autumn's harvest. The 5 usually ate together under the large oak tree beside the schoolhouse, sharing food and trading stories about their morning chores. The oak had been growing for decades before the first settlers arrived, its massive trunk requiring 3 children holding hands to encircle completely. Its branches provided shade in summer and shelter from light rain, making it a natural gathering place for students seeking refuge from the formal atmosphere inside the building. On this particular day, they discussed plans for Halloween, still 2 weeks away but already generating excitement among the valley's children. Martha described the costume her mother was helping her create, while James explained his intention to calculate exactly how much candy each house might distribute, based on the number of children in each family. The twins planned to coordinate their costumes in some elaborate scheme they refused to reveal, and Catherine shyly admitted she hoped to be brave enough to visit the supposedly haunted Henderson place at the far end of the valley. The afternoon lesson began at 1 o'clock sharp. Miss Hartwell called roll, as was her custom, receiving a clear present from each of her 23 students. She assigned reading from McGuffey's Eclectic Reader and watched as heads bent over worn books whose pages had educated children throughout the region. The familiar stories of moral instruction and character development provided common cultural touchstones that connected rural students to their peers in distant cities and foreign countries. Outside, clouds gathered from the west, their dark edges promising rain before evening. The temperature had risen slightly during the midday sun, but the approaching weather system brought the kind of atmospheric pressure changes that made animals restless and caused old injuries to ache. Miss Hartwell noticed several students glancing toward the windows as wind began to stir the colorful leaves that littered the schoolyard. At 3:30, Miss Hartwell rang the brass bell that signaled the end of the school day. The sound carried across the valley, informing parents that children would soon be making their way home to help with evening chores. Students gathered their belongings and filed out in small groups, heading toward their respective homes along paths they had walked countless times before. The five walked together initially as their paths converged for the first quarter-mile along the main track that connected the schoolhouse to the broader network of farm roads. Their voices carried on the still air as they continued discussions begun during the noon meal, their laughter echoing off the hills that surrounded their valley home. This was the last time anyone saw Martha, James, Anne, Samuel, and Catherine alive. When Martha and James failed to appear for evening chores, their father, Thomas Winslow, initially felt more annoyance than concern. At 14, Martha often lingered after school to help Miss Hartwell clean the blackboard or organize supplies for the following day's lessons. James sometimes stopped to examine interesting rocks or insects along the way home, his curious nature leading him to investigate every unusual sight with scientific thoroughness. But as darkness fell and his children remained absent, worry crept into Thomas's chest like cold water seeping through wool. The evening chores couldn't wait for tardy children, not with winter approaching and every hour of daylight precious for completing the season's final preparations. The cows needed milking, chickens required feeding, and firewood had to be split and stacked before the next morning's frost. He walked the path between school and home twice, calling their names into the gathering dusk. His voice carried far in the still air, echoing off distant hills before fading into silence. The schoolhouse stood empty, its windows dark and door securely latched. Miss Hartwell had long since returned to town, following her usual routine of walking the 3 miles before full darkness made the journey dangerous. Thomas retraced the route more carefully, searching for any sign of where his children might have left the main path. He examined every branching trail, every creek crossing, every cluster of trees where children might seek shelter or adventure. His lantern cast dancing shadows that transformed familiar landmarks into mysterious shapes, making his search both urgent and increasingly difficult. At the Brennan farm, Margaret Brennan paced her kitchen, watching the road through gingham curtains that she had sewn herself from fabric purchased at Henderson's store. Her twins had never been late for milking, understanding that the Holstein cattle operated on schedules as rigid as any factory timepiece. They took their responsibilities seriously, often arriving in the barn before their father finished bringing the cows in from pasture. The Brennan dairy operation depended on precise timing. Cows had to be milked at regular intervals to maintain production, and any disruption to their routine could affect the quantity and quality of milk for days afterward. Anne and Samuel understood this better than most adults, having grown up among the animals and absorbed the rhythms of agricultural life through daily experience rather than formal instruction. When full darkness settled over the valley, without any sign of Anne and Samuel, Margaret sent her eldest son to check with neighboring families. Perhaps the twins had stopped to help with some emergency, or maybe they had accepted an invitation to stay for supper with friends. But her maternal instincts already suggested something more serious had occurred, a feeling reinforced by the unusual behavior of the farm animals throughout the afternoon. The Holstein cattle had been restless since mid-afternoon, refusing to graze peacefully and instead gathering near the barn in nervous clusters. The farm's dogs had begun howling around sunset, their voices joining in a mournful chorus that seemed to echo from farms throughout the valley. Even the chickens had retreated to their coops earlier than usual, as if sensing some atmospheric disturbance that humans couldn't detect. The Murphy household erupted in panic when Catherine failed to appear by supper time. The youngest of 6 children, she was watched carefully by her mother, who had already lost 2 babies to fever and couldn't bear the thought of losing another child. Catherine's routine never varied: school, home, chores, supper, bed. She possessed neither the independence of older children nor the tendency to wander that characterized some of her peers. When Catherine's older siblings confirmed they hadn't seen her since morning, Sean Murphy grabbed his lantern and began searching every barn, shed, and outbuilding within 2 miles of their farm. His blacksmith's hands, accustomed to handling red-hot iron and heavy tools, trembled as he lifted latches and peered into dark corners where a small girl might seek shelter from approaching weather. The Murphy farm's location at the edge of the valley placed it closer to the deep forest that covered the surrounding hills. Sean had always been conscious of the potential dangers lurking in those woods: wild animals, abandoned mine shafts, and terrain treacherous enough to trap even experienced adults. The thought of his youngest daughter lost among those shadowy trees filled him with a terror that made his search increasingly frantic and disorganized. By 8 o'clock that evening, 3 separate search parties were combing the valley. Neighbors emerged from their homes carrying lanterns and calling the children's names into the darkness. The searches continued through the night, expanding outward in all directions from the schoolhouse like ripples spreading across a pond. Men on horseback covered the wider territory while women searched root cellars, haymows, and anywhere children might seek shelter from the increasingly cold October night. The valley had always been a close-knit community, but the crisis brought out levels of cooperation and mutual support that surprised even longtime residents. Families that rarely spoke beyond Sunday greetings organized themselves into efficient search teams, sharing resources and coordinating efforts with military precision. Women who had competed for years over whose preserves won prizes at the county fair worked side by side preparing meals for exhausted searchers. Dawn brought no answers, only the terrible confirmation that 5 children had simply vanished. Miss Hartwell arrived at the schoolhouse to find a crowd of parents and neighbors gathered in the yard, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion from the night's fruitless search. She confirmed that all 5 children had been present for afternoon lessons and had left at the usual time, their behavior normal and their spirits apparently high. The schoolroom itself offered no clues. The children's school slates remained on their desks, homework assignments half completed in handwriting that now seemed heartbreakingly normal. Martha's slate showed a half-finished essay about autumn leaves, while James had been working mathematical problems that demonstrated his advanced abilities. The Brennan twins had been copying poetry, their identical handwriting creating mirror images across their shared slate. Catherine's primer lay open to a page about farm animals, the simple illustrations now seeming to mock the agricultural paradise that had somehow swallowed their children. The county sheriff, a gruff man named Benjamin Cross, who had dealt with everything from cattle rustlers to claimed jumpers during his 20 years in office, arrived from the county seat that afternoon. He brought with him 2 deputies and a bloodhound borrowed from a neighboring county, along with experience investigating cases that often ended badly for missing persons in frontier regions. Sheriff Cross examined the schoolhouse methodically, interviewing Miss Hartwell and several other students who had walked partway home with the missing children. The last confirmed sighting placed all 5 at the fork, where the main path split toward their respective farms, approximately a quarter mile from the schoolhouse and still within sight of several farmhouses. Beyond that point, they had simply disappeared. The sheriff organized the search effort with military precision learned during his service in the Indian Wars 20 years earlier. Teams of men covered every square mile within a 10-mile radius of the schoolhouse, working in coordinated sweeps that ensured no area was overlooked. They searched abandoned cabins left by failed homesteaders, mine shafts dug by optimistic prospectors, and dense thickets where children might have become lost or trapped. Dogs borrowed from neighboring counties tracked scents that led nowhere, circling back to the schoolhouse or simply ending at creek beds and rocky ground where odors couldn't penetrate. The animals seemed confused rather than unsuccessful, as if the children's scents had been deliberately obscured or masked by other odors that interfered with normal tracking procedures. For 3 weeks, the search continued with an intensity that transformed the valley's daily rhythms. Farmers abandoned their harvest to comb through forests and fields, leaving corn to rot in stalks and apples to fall ungathered from trees. Women prepared endless meals for the search parties, their own children kept close to home and never allowed to walk alone even short distances. The normal patterns of rural life ceased as an entire community focused on finding their missing children. Markets weren't attended, social visits were canceled, and even church services were modified to include prayers for the safe return of the 5 who had vanished. The outside world seemed to fade away as the valley turned inward, consumed by the mystery that had struck at its heart. As October turned to November, hope began to fade. Sheriff Cross brought in investigators from the state capitol, men with experience in kidnapping cases and access to resources unavailable in rural counties. They arrived with modern equipment and scientific methods, determined to solve a case that had baffled local authorities and captured newspaper attention throughout the region. The state investigators interviewed every adult in the valley, searching for anyone who might have harbored ill intentions toward children. They examined the possibility that the children had fled voluntarily, perhaps frightened by something at school or home. They investigated traveling salesmen, seasonal workers, and anyone else who might have passed through the valley during the critical time period. They found nothing. No evidence of violence, no signs of struggle, no indication that the children had been taken against their will or had fled voluntarily. They had simply walked out of the schoolhouse that October afternoon and disappeared as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. The investigators' final report, filed in November 1898, concluded that the 5 children had most likely encountered some natural disaster that had concealed their remains. Perhaps they had fallen through ice on a hidden pond, or become trapped in a cave-in at an abandoned mine. The report recommended that the search be suspended until spring weather allowed more thorough investigation of remote areas currently inaccessible due to early snow. Winter closed over Millbrook Valley like a heavy blanket, ending the search efforts and forcing the community to confront the reality that their children might never return. Snow covered any remaining traces the children might have left, while freezing temperatures made outdoor investigation impossible for anyone except the most desperate parents who continued solitary searches, despite official recommendations. The 5 families retreated into their grief, maintaining hope that somehow their children might return with spring's thaw. Thomas Winslow spent hours staring out windows toward the path his children had walked home hundreds of times, while Margaret Brennan set places at her table for Anne and Samuel throughout the winter months. The Murphy family gathered each evening to recite prayers for Catherine's safe return, their Irish faith providing comfort that logic couldn't supply. Years passed with agonizing slowness. The missing children became local legend, their story passed down through generations of valley residents who added details, embellishments, and theories with each retelling. New families moved into the area, unaware of the tragedy, until they noticed the 5 weathered crosses in the village cemetery, marking empty graves that commemorated lives cut short by unknown circumstances. The schoolhouse continued to operate, though parents watched their children more carefully and teachers took attendance with extra diligence. Miss Hartwell left the valley the following spring, unable to bear the weight of memory every time she entered the classroom where she had last seen her missing students. She was replaced by a series of teachers who never stayed long, as if the schoolhouse itself carried the echo of that terrible October day. The Winslow farm was sold in 1902. Thomas Winslow never recovered from the loss of his children, spending his final years staring out at the path they had walked home hundreds of times before vanishing forever. His wife had died 2 years earlier, some said of a broken heart, though the doctor listed pneumonia as the official cause. Their farm was purchased by relatives from Pennsylvania who knew nothing of the tragedy, and brought their own children to play in the same yards where Martha and James had grown up. Margaret Brennan lived until 1923, dying at her kitchen table while looking through the window toward the road where she had waited so many evenings for Anne and Samuel to return from school. Her husband had passed in 1915, leaving her to operate the dairy with help from hired men and her surviving children. But the heart had gone out of the operation after the twins disappeared, and the farm was gradually reduced in scope until it supported only the family's immediate needs. The Murphy family moved to Chicago in 1903, seeking to escape the memories that haunted every corner of their small farm. Sean Murphy found work in the steel mills, his blacksmith skills translating well to industrial employment that paid better than agricultural work. But he never forgot the valley where Catherine had vanished, and family members reported that he would sometimes wake screaming her name, convinced he could hear her calling for help from somewhere far away. By 1920, most of the original families had left the valley. New residents knew the story, but considered it ancient history, a tragedy from another era that had no bearing on their own lives. The schoolhouse was converted to a community meeting hall, its classroom desks stored in the basement, where they gathered dust and memories. The paths the children had walked became overgrown with berry bushes and young trees that gradually obscured the routes between homes and school. The valley evolved with the changing times. Automobiles began appearing on improved roads that connected rural communities to growing cities. Electricity reached some of the larger farms, bringing modern conveniences that previous generations couldn't have imagined. But beneath the surface changes, the mystery of the 5 missing children continued to haunt local consciousness like an unhealed wound. In 1935, the county decided to build a new road through the valley, connecting it more directly to the growing town 15 miles east and opening the region to increased commerce and development. The construction project promised to bring prosperity to an area that had remained isolated since its founding, but it would also disturb ground that had lain untouched for decades. The construction crew arrived in early spring, equipped with modern machinery to cut through hills and bridge streams with efficiency that would have amazed the valley's original settlers. The project required clearing several acres of forest that had grown thick over the decades since the original settlement, removing trees that had stood for generations, and exposing earth that hadn't seen sunlight for 50 years. Work began at the eastern edge of the valley, where the new road would connect to the existing highway system. The crew consisted of 20 men, most of them unemployed farmers, grateful for steady work during the Depression years that had devastated rural economies throughout the region. They worked with steam shovels and teams of horses, clearing trees and moving earth with methodical efficiency that promised completion ahead of schedule. The crew foreman, Carl Henderson, was a veteran construction supervisor who had worked road crews across 3 states during his 40-year career. He had seen every type of terrain and obstacle that road construction could encounter, from solid rock that required dynamite to swampland that swallowed machinery. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what his crew would discover in the deep woods of Millbrook Valley. By late May, they had cut a swath nearly 3 miles into the valley. The roadbed stretched like a raw wound through the forest, exposing red clay and limestone outcroppings that hadn't seen sunlight for centuries. Each day brought them closer to the old schoolhouse, which would need to be demolished to make way for the new thoroughfare that promised to modernize the entire region. The work proceeded smoothly until June 3, 1943, exactly 45 years after the children's disappearance. Machine operator Frank Kowalski was clearing a grove of old oaks when his steam shovel struck something unexpected. The bucket scraped across what felt like stone, producing a sound different from the usual thunk of roots or rocks that typically impeded construction progress. Frank shut down the engine and climbed down to investigate. Partially exposed in the fresh earth was a section of fitted stone, obviously man-made, but unlike anything that should have existed in that location. The stonework appeared to be part of a larger structure buried beneath decades of forest growth, its purpose and origin completely mysterious. Anderson examined the stonework carefully. The blocks were cut limestone, fitted together with precision that spoke of skilled craftsmanship and considerable time investment, but there were no records of any stone structures in this part of the valley. The original survey maps showed nothing but forest in this location, and the oldest residents Henderson had consulted insisted no buildings had ever stood here. The discovery violated everything Henderson understood about the valley's history. Stone construction required significant resources and skilled labor, neither of which should have been available in this remote location during the region's settlement period. The quality of the workmanship suggested European training and access to tools that frontier craftsmen rarely possessed. Henderson ordered his crew to carefully excavate around the stone structure. Over the next 2 days, they revealed walls forming what appeared to be a rectangular chamber, approximately 8 feet by 12 feet, built entirely below ground level. The workmanship was exceptional. with walls rising 6 feet high and topped by massive stone slabs that had formed a roof strong enough to support the weight of soil and trees that had grown above it. The chamber had been completely hidden beneath decades of forest growth. Oak trees had grown directly over it, their roots working between the stones but never seriously disturbing the structure's integrity. Only the construction crew's deep excavation had revealed its existence, and Henderson realized that without the road project, the chamber might have remained hidden indefinitely. Henderson contacted Sheriff William Morrison, Sheriff Cross's successor, who arrived with Deputy Tom Fletcher and Dr. Arthur Kellerman, the county coroner. What they found inside the stone chamber would answer questions that had haunted the valley for nearly half a century, while raising new mysteries that seemed even more disturbing than the original disappearance. The chamber contained 5 small skeletons, arranged in a deliberate pattern on the stone floor. 4 skeletons lay with their heads pointing toward the center, where the 5th skeleton rested in a position that suggested special significance. Scraps of clothing, preserved by the dry conditions inside the sealed chamber, confirmed what everyone already suspected. These were the remains of Martha and James Winslow, Anne and Samuel Brennan, and Catherine Murphy. Dr. Kellerman conducted his examination with meticulous care, documenting every detail of the skeletons' positions and condition. The children appeared to have died peacefully, with no signs of violence or trauma visible on their bones. More puzzling was their arrangement, which seemed intentional rather than accidental, as if their bodies had been placed according to some predetermined plan or ritual significance. Personal effects found with the remains confirmed their identities beyond any reasonable doubt. Martha's silver locket, a gift from her grandmother, lay beside her skull, its chain still intact despite 45 years in the sealed chamber. James's prized collection of unusual stones filled his trouser pockets, the same rocks he had been gathering on his walks home from school. The Brennan twins each wore the matching wooden crosses their mother had carved for their confirmation, while Catherine clutched a small rag doll, its fabric faded but recognizable as the toy she had carried to school every day. But the most disturbing discovery was a collection of items that clearly hadn't belonged to the 5 children. Arranged along the chamber's walls were dozens of personal belongings spanning several decades: jewelry, clothing fragments, children's toys, and other small objects that suggested this chamber had been used for similar purposes many times over many years. The additional artifacts created a timeline of horror that extended far beyond the 1898 disappearance. Jewelry styles and clothing fashions represented decades of previous victims, while toys and personal items suggested that entire generations of children had met their fate in this hidden stone tomb. The systematic nature of the collection indicated planning and organization that transcended any single criminal act. Sheriff Morrison expanded the investigation immediately. The chamber's construction predated any known settlement in the valley, yet the stonework showed clear evidence of European techniques and tools. Carbon dating of wood fragments found in the mortar placed the construction sometime in the early 1800s, decades before the first homesteaders arrived in the region. A comprehensive search of county records revealed disturbing patterns that had been overlooked by previous investigators. Over the previous century, children had disappeared from communities throughout the region, usually in groups of 3 to 5, always without explanation or trace. The disappearances occurred roughly every 15 to 20 years, suggesting a systematic pattern rather than random tragedy. The investigation team found evidence of additional chambers in the surrounding forest. Ground-penetrating radar revealed at least 3 more stone structures hidden beneath the forest floor, though officials decided against excavating them until they better understood what they were dealing with. The possibility that dozens of children had vanished over the decades created logistical and emotional challenges that required careful planning and coordination. Local historians researched the valley's earliest settlement records, finding references to Native American warnings about evil spirits in certain parts of the forest. The indigenous people who had originally inhabited the region spoke of places where children should never venture alone, locations where the earth itself was hungry for young souls. These warnings had been dismissed by European settlers as primitive superstition, but the discovery of the chambers suggested that ancient knowledge might have contained literal truth. The systematic targeting of children and the sophisticated burial methods indicated human agency rather than supernatural forces, But the scale and duration of the activity created a legacy of horror that transcended normal criminal behavior. More concrete evidence emerged from archived newspaper reports stored in the state capital's Historical Society. Between 1823 and 1890, 17 separate incidents of missing children had been reported in communities within 50 miles of Millbrook Valley. In each case, small groups of children had vanished without trace, their disappearances following patterns remarkably similar to the 1898 incident. The newspaper accounts revealed details that local investigations had missed or ignored. Children typically disappeared during afternoon hours, usually while walking home from school or traveling between neighboring farms. Weather conditions were often mentioned as clear and calm, eliminating natural disasters as explanations. Most significantly, the disappearances seemed to cluster around certain geographical areas, suggesting that perpetrators had operated from fixed bases rather than moving randomly through the region. The pattern suggested the work of someone or some group who had operated in the region for decades. The stone chambers represented a level of planning and construction that indicated significant resources and long-term commitment. Yet no individual or organization had ever been identified as responsible, despite investigations by multiple law enforcement agencies over several decades. Investigation of the chamber's contents revealed additional disturbing details that deepened rather than resolved the mystery. Analysis of the personal effects suggested victims spanning at least 60 years, from the 1820s through the 1890s. The quality and style of clothing fragments, jewelry, and toys created a timeline of tragedy stretching back to the valley's earliest settlement period. Chemical analysis of residues found in the chamber indicated the use of preservatives or embalming substances, suggesting sophisticated knowledge of body preservation techniques. The materials used were not commonly available to frontier residents, implying either specialized training or access to supplies that required considerable resources and planning. Dr. Kellerman's examination of the skeletons provided few additional clues about the cause of death. The children showed no signs of violence, malnutrition, or disease that would explain their deaths. They appeared to have died quickly and peacefully, which made their presence in the buried chamber even more mysterious and disturbing. The discovery sent shockwaves through communities across the region. Families whose children had disappeared decades earlier finally had confirmation that their worst fears had been realized, though the answers raised more questions than they resolved. The systematic nature of the disappearances, the sophisticated burial chambers, and the complete lack of evidence pointing to any perpetrator created a mystery that seemed to defy rational explanation. Sheriff Morrison assembled a task force, including investigators from the state police and federal authorities. They interviewed elderly residents throughout the region, searching for any memories or stories that might provide clues about who had constructed the chambers or why children had been systematically targeted over such an extended period. The interviews revealed a pattern of folklore and superstition surrounding certain areas of the forest that had been dismissed as rural mythology. Multiple families reported warnings passed down through generations about places where children should never play alone. Some spoke of strange sounds heard in the woods on certain nights, or of children reporting encounters with mysterious figures who offered candy or toys in exchange for accompanying them to secret locations. Federal investigators examined the possibility of a religious cult or secret society operating in the region. The careful arrangement of the skeletons suggested ritual significance, while the systematic targeting of children indicated an organized group with specific beliefs or practices. However, no historical records documented any such organization in the area, despite extensive research in religious and fraternal archives. As summer progressed, the investigation expanded to include archaeological experts and anthropologists from major universities. They studied the construction techniques used in the chambers, searching for cultural markers that might identify the builders. The stonework showed influences from several European traditions, suggesting builders with diverse backgrounds or extensive travel experience that would have been unusual in frontier communities. The road construction project was suspended indefinitely while investigators continued their work. The original chamber was carefully photographed and documented before the remains were removed for proper burial. The families of the 1898 victims finally held funeral services for their children, laying them to rest in the village cemetery beneath the weathered crosses that had waited 45 years for the bodies they commemorated. Throughout the investigation, one question haunted everyone involved. Had the perpetrators died out naturally, or had they simply moved their activities elsewhere? The pattern of disappearances seemed to end in the 1890s, coinciding roughly with improved communication and transportation that might have made such systematic predation more difficult to conceal. Modern investigative techniques revealed additional details about the chamber's history that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Soil analysis showed evidence of repeated disturbance over several decades, confirming that the chamber had been opened and sealed multiple times. Chemical residues suggested the use of preservatives or embalming substances that indicated sophisticated knowledge of body preservation techniques. The investigation uncovered one final, chilling detail in the county courthouse records. Among the property deeds and tax assessments from the 1890s was a notation about a land purchase in the forest where the chambers were found. The buyer was listed only as the Preservation Society, with no additional identifying information. The land had been sold again in 1901 to a lumber company, which eventually allowed it to revert to forest when timber prices fell. No other records of the Preservation Society could be found in any regional archives. The organization had appeared briefly in the historical record, just long enough to purchase the land where the chambers were located, then vanished as completely as the children they had claimed. Bank records showed that payment had been made in gold coin, suggesting either significant wealth or access to resources that transcended normal commercial channels. Legal researchers expanded their investigation to neighboring states, searching for any mention of the Preservation Society in corporate filings, newspaper advertisements, or court records. They found nothing. The organization had existed just long enough to secure legal ownership of the land where they conducted their horrific activities, then disappeared without leaving any trace of their membership, leadership, or ultimate purpose. By autumn of 1943, the official investigation was suspended without resolution. The 5 children from 1898 had been laid to rest, their families finally able to grieve properly after 4.5 decades of uncertainty. The stone chamber was sealed and marked with a memorial plaque, though the location remained restricted to prevent curiosity seekers from disturbing the site or potentially discovering additional horrors hidden beneath the forest floor. The investigation had consumed thousands of man-hours and considerable resources, involving experts from multiple disciplines and jurisdictions. Yet for all the scientific analysis, historical research, and methodical detective work, the core questions remained unanswered. Who had constructed the chambers? Why had children been systematically targeted? What had motivated such elaborate and long-term criminal activity? Federal agents compiled a final report that cataloged every piece of evidence discovered during the investigation. The document ran to over 300 pages, detailing the chamber's construction, the artifacts found within, and the historical pattern of disappearances that stretched back to the region's earliest settlement. But the conclusion remained frustratingly inconclusive. The perpetrators had operated with such secrecy and sophistication that they had successfully concealed their identities and motives for over a century. The new road was eventually completed along a different route, avoiding the area where the chambers had been discovered. Engineers found that rerouting the highway added less than 2 miles to the total distance while allowing the investigation site to remain undisturbed. The section of forest was designated as a county preserve, officially protected from development, but unofficially avoided by local residents who preferred not to venture too close to places where such dark mysteries had unfolded. Local reaction to the discovery evolved through several phases. Initial shock gave way to morbid fascination as details emerged about the scope and sophistication of the criminal operation. Some residents demanded that all suspected burial sites be excavated immediately, regardless of cost or complexity. Others argued for leaving the remaining chambers undisturbed, fearing that further investigation might uncover horrors too terrible to confront. The debate split the community along generational lines. Older residents who remembered the original disappearance felt entitled to complete answers, regardless of how disturbing those answers might prove. Younger families worried about the psychological impact on their children and the potential damage to property values if the area became associated with serial murder and ritualistic burial practices. Church leaders throughout the region struggled to provide spiritual guidance for communities grappling with evidence of systematic evil that challenged conventional understanding of human nature. Some sermons focused on the ultimate triumph of justice, emphasizing that truth had finally emerged despite decades of concealment. Others stressed the importance of forgiveness and healing, encouraging congregations to focus on memorial rather than vengeance. The story of the 5 missing children became part of regional folklore, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. Some versions focused on the tragedy of the families who waited decades for answers about their loved ones' fate. Others emphasized the mysterious circumstances of the disappearances and the questions that remained unanswered despite intensive investigation. Miss Eleanor Hartwell, the teacher who had dismissed the children for the last time on October 13, 1898, lived until 1961. She never spoke publicly about the events of that day, maintaining the dignified silence she had preserved for over 60 years. But neighbors reported that she kept newspaper clippings about the discovery in a special wooden box, reading them often in her final years, as if searching for details that might provide closure or understanding. She died knowing that her students had finally been found and properly buried, though the mystery of what had happened to them remained as deep as ever. Her personal effects included a diary that covered her years as a teacher, but the entries for October 1898 were missing, apparently torn out long ago. Whether she had removed them herself or whether they had been taken by someone else remained another unsolved mystery in a case that seemed to generate more questions than answers. The families who had suffered such devastating losses found some peace in finally laying their children to rest. Memorial services held in the autumn of 1943 drew hundreds of mourners, including descendants of the original families and longtime residents who had grown up with the story of the missing children. But the knowledge that their loved ones had been victims of something larger and more sinister than a simple tragedy added new dimensions to their grief. Thomas Winslow's surviving relatives attended the funeral service for Martha and James, bringing flowers grown from seeds that had been planted in the family garden decades earlier. The Brennan family dairy had been sold years before, but former employees and neighboring farmers gathered to honor Anne and Samuel's memory. Catherine Murphy's siblings, now elderly themselves, traveled from Chicago to witness their sister's final burial in ground that had waited nearly half a century for her return. The systematic nature of the disappearances suggested that the children's fate had been planned long before that October afternoon when they walked home from school for the last time. This realization transformed their story from random tragedy to calculated victimization, creating new layers of horror for families who had already endured decades of uncertainty and grief. Investigation records revealed disturbing details about the Preservation Society's apparent methodology. Property records showed that they had owned land near several communities where children had disappeared, always purchasing through intermediaries who left no traceable connections to any identifiable individuals. The timing of their land acquisitions correlated closely with disappearance patterns, suggesting advanced planning that might have extended months or even years before each incident. Bank records from the 1890s showed a series of gold coin transactions that funded the land purchases and presumably supported the organization's other activities. The amounts involved suggested significant financial resources, far beyond what most frontier residents could accumulate through legitimate means. The source of these funds remained completely mysterious, adding another layer to an already incomprehensible case. Modern psychological analysis of the evidence suggested that the Preservation Society had operated according to some systematic belief system that justified their actions in terms that made sense to the participants. The careful arrangement of bodies, the elaborate burial chambers, and the methodical targeting of children all pointed to organized activity guided by specific principles or rituals. Some experts theorize that the organization might have believed they were preserving children in some spiritual or physical sense, though the exact nature of their beliefs remained purely speculative. Others suggested that the group might have been conducting primitive anthropological or medical research, though the historical period made such scientific motivation unlikely. The most disturbing possibility was that the Preservation Society had simply enjoyed their activities and had developed elaborate justifications for behavior they knew to be wrong. This interpretation suggested a level of organized psychopathy that challenged conventional understanding of criminal behavior, particularly in frontier communities where social oversight typically prevented such systematic predation. Today, the Millbrook Valley bears little resemblance to the farming community of 1898. Modern homes dot the hillsides where wheat fields once stretched toward the mountains, their manicured lawns and suburban architecture creating a landscape that would be unrecognizable to the valley's original settlers. The old schoolhouse was demolished decades ago, its foundation stones scattered and forgotten beneath parking lots and shopping centers. The paths that children walked home have been replaced by paved roads and suburban streets that carry names like Maple Avenue and Oak Drive, pastoral designations that obscure the area's agricultural heritage. New residents often discover the valley's dark history only when longtime neighbors mention the missing children or when curious researchers visit the county preserve where the chambers were discovered. But the forest preserve remains largely untouched, its trails marked with warnings about unstable ground and dangerous terrain. The official explanations cite concerns about erosion and wildlife preservation, but local residents know the real reason for the restrictions. The area where the chambers were found has been quietly maintained as a memorial space, though few people visit and fewer still linger long enough to contemplate the horrors that once unfolded beneath the peaceful forest canopy. The discovery of the stone chambers answered the question of what happened to Martha and James Winslow, Anne and Samuel Brennan, and Catherine Murphy. But it revealed an even more disturbing truth. Their disappearance was part of a pattern of systematic predation that had operated in the shadows for decades, leaving behind only carefully constructed tombs and the grief of families who waited generations for answers that would never fully come. The mystery of who built the chambers, why children were systematically targeted, and whether similar activities continued elsewhere remains unsolved to this day. The Preservation Society, if that was truly their name, succeeded in preserving their victims but left no trace of their own identity, motives, or ultimate fate. They vanished into history as completely as the children they claimed, leaving behind only questions that grow deeper and more disturbing with each passing year. Recent developments have added new chapters to this already complex story. In 1987, construction workers building a shopping mall 30 miles from Millbrook Valley discovered a stone chamber remarkably similar to those found in 1943. The chamber contained the remains of 3 children who had disappeared in 1911, along with artifacts suggesting it had been used multiple times over several decades. This discovery prompted renewed investigation into the Preservation Society's activities, revealing that their operations had extended far beyond the Millbrook Valley region. Computer analysis of historical records identified possible chamber sites in 7 states, creating a network of criminal activity that spanned hundreds of miles and potentially involved dozens of participants. Modern investigative techniques have provided new insights into the organization's structure and methods. DNA analysis of hair and tissue samples found in various chambers suggests that the Preservation Society recruited members from multiple ethnic backgrounds, indicating either unusual diversity for a frontier organization or connections that transcended local community boundaries. Archaeological investigation of chamber construction techniques has revealed that different sites were built by different individuals, though all followed similar architectural principles. This suggests either extensive training programs that taught consistent building methods or detailed written instructions that were followed precisely across multiple locations and time periods. The most recent discovery occurred in 2003, when Hurricane Isabel's flooding exposed a partially collapsed chamber in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. The site contained evidence of activity as late as the 1920s, indicating that the Preservation Society or similar organizations continued operating well into the 20th century, adapting their methods to changing social conditions and improved law enforcement capabilities. Each new discovery adds pieces to a puzzle that seems to grow more complex rather than approaching solution. The systematic nature of the organization's activities, their sophisticated construction techniques, and their ability to operate undetected for decades suggest a level of planning and coordination that challenges conventional understanding of historical criminal behavior. Families of more recent victims have formed support groups that provide emotional assistance while advocating for continued investigation into the Preservation Society's activities. These groups maintain websites that catalog known disappearances, share research findings, and coordinate efforts to locate additional burial sites that might provide new evidence about the organization's structure and methods. Law enforcement agencies now recognize the Preservation Society case as one of America's most extensive and long-running serial crime investigations. The FBI maintains an active file on the organization, though no credible leads have emerged in recent years. Advances in forensic technology continue to provide new insights into existing evidence, but the fundamental questions about the organization's identity and motivations remain unanswered. In the end, the story of the 5 children who left school in 1898 and never came home serves as a reminder that some mysteries resist solution, no matter how much time passes or how thoroughly they are investigated. The stone chambers stand as monuments to both the victims who were lost and the families who never stopped searching for answers, even when those answers proved more disturbing than the original questions. The truth, when it finally emerged 45 years later, provided closure for some and opened new wounds for others. It confirmed that the children had not suffered, but revealed that their deaths were part of something far larger and more sinister than anyone had imagined. The mystery of the Preservation Society and their systematic collection of young victims remains one of the region's most disturbing unsolved cases, a reminder that evil can operate even in the most remote and peaceful communities, leaving behind only shadows and questions that echo through generations. The 5 weathered crosses in the Millbrook Valley Cemetery now mark graves that actually contain the children they commemorate, but the inscription added after their discovery acknowledges that while their bodies have finally come home, the mystery of their fate continues to haunt everyone who learns their story. The final line reads simply, "Found but not forgotten, answered but not understood." This case continues to influence how law enforcement agencies investigate missing children cases, particularly those involving multiple victims from rural communities. The systematic documentation methods developed during the Preservation Society investigation have become standard protocols for complex historical cases, while the psychological profiling techniques pioneered during the research have contributed to modern understanding of organized criminal behavior. The children's story has also become part of educational curricula in schools throughout the region, though details are carefully adapted for different age groups. Elementary students learn about community cooperation during times of crisis, while older students study the investigation as an example of how modern forensic science can provide answers to historical mysteries. But perhaps the most important legacy of Martha, James, Anne, Samuel, and Catherine lies in the reminder that every missing child represents a family's deepest fear and greatest loss. Their story continues to resonate because it transforms abstract statistics about missing persons into human faces and individual tragedies that demand both remembrance and vigilance. The Preservation Society's activities ended, but similar threats continue to exist in new forms adapted to contemporary conditions. The children's story serves as both historical tragedy and modern warning, reminding parents, teachers, and communities that the responsibility for protecting children belongs to everyone and requires constant awareness of dangers that may operate in shadows beyond normal recognition or understanding. The mystery may never be completely solved, but the memory of 5 children who trusted the world enough to walk home from school on an October afternoon in 1898 continues to inspire efforts to ensure that such systematic predation never again operates undetected for generations. Their story has become part of the permanent record of human experience, preserving not only their memory, but also the lesson that some questions demand answers, even when those answers challenge everything we thought we understood about the communities where we live and the people we trust to protect our most vulnerable members.